All right, we are live. Welcome to the third Resistance seminar. I am so happy to have everybody here watching with us. Remember that you can ask questions or send in comments through the live chat on the YouTube portal if you are watching via that means. Also, you can watch this later on. The video will be stored. You can watch this later on and always engage in conversation with me and with others in the Facebook group if you're part of that as well. And if you want any information about that, that'll all be below, links below. Today, I am thrilled to have with me Annanda Barclay, who is currently a pastoral intern at First Pres Palo Alto. I first became aware of her work through an incredible sermon and speech she gave for More Light Presbyterians a couple years back. And then we started talking with her and asking her to contribute to Faithful Resistance, Rick Ufford Chase's book, and she contributed to the second chapter on Black Lives Matter and told a little bit of her story there. So she's an amazing person. If you haven't heard of her yet, you certainly will be soon. She's going to be doing some awesome work in the church. Already is doing some awesome work and is going to continue doing some awesome work in the church. I'm thrilled to have her with us today. So Annanda, I wonder if you could just start out by telling us some of your story, your history in the church, and the way that informs and connects to your understanding of the Black Lives Matter movement.
Thanks, Art, and it's a privilege to be here, and I'm excited that we're doing this work at the church. It's crucial and it's huge, I think, living out our discipleship. So my history is I'm a cradle Presbyterian. I'm third generation Presbyterian. My grandparents moved here, immigrated here from Jamaica, and the closest church that they could find that's close to the British system that they were used to was the Presbyterian church. And so the church that I was baptized in was a church that my dad and my aunt were baptized in. That being said, it was a church on south side of Chicago. And until I was, like 12 years old, I had no clue that Presbyterians were white. I had absolutely zero. All I'd seen is Black Presbyterians in that one congregation. And the only white folk that I saw were like this group of young adults, like yads, and the church held them as they did like a mission that year, like that summer. And I was like, this is interesting, but didn't think anything of it, right? So like I'd come after church and we'd always have a meal and food. And to this day, this church does this, has a meal and food right after service. And I'd always play basketball because there's a little gym. And just that one time I saw these, like young white adults, and I was like, well, you want to play some ball? Like it did. I was like, this is odd, but it just didn't cross my mind.
In the church, I'm thrilled to have her with us today.
Thank you.
Let's just go ahead and start over with your introduction. That way that anyone who came in the middle of that was getting confused. All right. You, Annanda, tell us a little bit about your experience growing up in Presbyterian churches and the way that has informed your work in the movement for Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. So again, grew up in an all-Black PCUSA church. I had no clue that Presbyterians were majority white. Like the only white Presbyterians I saw were young adults that came one summer to do a YAD activity, which I have no clue. I was like, I don't know, in third grade. And I was like, oh, that's weird. There's white people. Let's play basketball, and just kept on keeping on, right? As I got older, I moved to Georgia as opposed to Chicago, right? North Atlanta suburbs. And it was an all-white Presbyterian church. And again, the unique thing about the church is you can go anywhere and the worship's essentially the same, right? So it's helpful to plug in. Maybe the style is different, right?
Right.
But the worship, the order worship is essentially the same. So it was there when I moved to Georgia that I heard of Montree, that I heard of that had a better working of the presbytery, that I just saw resources that I just had never seen before. And then I also realized that I'm a part of a predominantly white church, and I just had no clue. It was kind of a mind blow. And so that to me was the first big stark of realizing, oh, there's something different here, and how come we don't know about each other? How come I didn't know that this existed? And then did my older elders, did they know? What access did they have or didn't have? Or were they seen as novelties? Or was their pastor seen as a novelty or a great person to know, right? But maybe not necessarily to integrate. And so that was my first huge just smack in the face with how we operate as a church on a broader scale. Well-intentioned, but this exists. And so going into seminary, I saw the pattern repeat itself. That I realized that there are other Black Presbyterians around, right, that have also had these experiences of either being a part of this one historically Black Presbyterian church, or they're like the chip and the cookie, right? The one or two, Black folk that are part of this majority white congregation and are constantly navigating space. And so like there's this spread outness of everybody, or this idea that or it's not even an idea, or segregation, and so that has been a huge thing for me, especially as a Black queer person navigating the church. How to participate in it, how I'm included in it, how other folks are included in it, other people of color, and how we can connect with each other, and also how the majority white church can connect with us in ways that aren't, culturally appropriation, or it always feels weird and icky. So how do we acknowledge the discomfort, but acknowledge it in a way that we're actually trying to get to know each other, and see the eyes of God in each other's face, as opposed to noting our differences as inherently bad or problematic.
Yeah, and I think that something you speak to that that I really think people can intuitively understand, and which has troubled me some recently, is this sense of sort of like blindness and helplessness. Like most presbyteries are aware that they have one or two immigrant communities or historically Black congregations in their midst, and know that they're not well linked up with them, and most people feel kind of helpless about, I don't know how to fix this, and it's just sort of sitting there. It strikes me that there's this general desire to want to be well integrated and want to be in connection and in relationship with each other, but really that only goes so far. It's sort of said at a surface level, but then it never actually gets to a deep level. I'm writing an essay right now where I'm actually talking about the what I'm calling the defective white conscience, because it seems like a lot of white people, and I include myself here, obviously, I'm a white person. It seems like a lot of white people ultimately are only made uncomfortable by racism to a certain point. And then at a certain point, they grow tired and are quite willing to just sort of put up with it, beyond that. And Rick talked about in his book, in the chapter, in responding to you, his experience as a child growing up in a congregation that was actually a joint congregation. It was an integrated congregation, a historically Black church and a white church merged. And then nothing changed. The white church just still ran everything, and the Black people in the church were just expected to sort of become part of the white church and do everything the way the white church did, to the point where they actually had, violence in their city. There were the National Guard was called in. This was during the 60s. There was, it was major headline news, and it was never addressed in the church. Like the church never spoke about it. Like there's this huge disconnect of like just the church saying or seeming to want to deal with race, but then actually very much not wanting to deal with it when it gets real, when it becomes something that isn't abstract any longer but is present.
Right. And like what is that about too? It's about like power and control, right? It's like liking the idea of being integrated, but are you integrated? Or is this just a number count? I look at it like, I think a great analogy is when churches talk about, we need more young people, we need more young adults and young families. Well, it's like, do you really want young adults and young families here? Because they're going to change the makeup of the congregation. They're going to change the culture of the congregation. Or do you want them there as body ornaments, right? Like, it's a similar concept. And so for me, I think that point that you brought up is huge. I look at it in terms of self-interest, right? I think one of the biggest ways that white supremacy hurts white people is it's not talked about how white supremacy hurts white people. And And one of the biggest ways is the idea that it's a zero-sum game, right? That you just have privilege, you have the supremacy, and it's so like you have the privilege to ignore it, but it's not affecting you. And that's the lie. It is affecting you, right? I think it clearly on a moral conscious level, it affects you economically. But I think to the extent of getting tired, I think that's a lack of seeing white self-interest. So to give a good example, what I've been doing with my congregation is I've done an adult study called Spirituality, Compassion, and Dismantling White Supremacy. And we're talking about first, the compassionate component of empathy and how, you have to love your neighbor as yourself. So do you love yourself? And what does self-love look like? And can you honestly say you love yourself while, your Black sibling on the street is getting shot and you're just like, oh, well, another one, what do I do? After a while, white guilt, white shame can go into a state of paralysis, which isn't helpful. And then paradoxically, ironically, it makes it all about white people again, right?
Absolutely.
And there's this false idea that Black history is just reserved for Black people, that it's also not a part of white history, right? And it is. And so for me, it's a giant thing of myth busting. And so we had to go back and just do just a whole nother lesson of history. So I went back and talked about the slave trade and Joy DeGrew's work. Dr. Joy DeGrew, she's a professor at the University of London now, but she used to be in Oregon, on post-traumatic slave syndrome, which is talking about the historical trauma of slavery that has been untreated for the past 400 years in the United States. So what do you do with this PTSD that's been happening to Black folk, and cognitive dissonance, which is how you're able to kind of shut it off or excuse it or think or see something that really contradicts reality. Donald Trump is a great example. How that cognitive dissonance affects us and how that's passed down, well-intentioned for the most part, but how that's passed down from generation to generation as means of survival. And so I feel like, we can plug in right now and, for those of you who are just entering the Black Lives Matter movement or just entering talks about conversation and race, I think pointing to current history and civil rights is helpful, but really I think it's helpful for you to go back to the origin and say, what has historically been going on? Because this is a buildup. This isn't new. It's not like we are picking up the mantle from MLK, but it's not a matter of we just started from Martin Luther King, right? MLK started back from slavery and we're still starting back from slavery, right? And so I think that needs to be addressed. And I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a great example of how those intersections connect and how that history is still taking place today. If we look at just the nature of where our churches are, geographically speaking, like my church is in Palo Alto and there's an East Palo Alto. And what does East Palo Alto look like? Looks like people of color, Black, Latino, Tongan, right? Very not poor, poor or working class. And to give you an idea of how the exorbitant amount of wealth where I live, if you make $70,000 a year here, you can still qualify for food stamps, right? So like, it's important, I think, to know our geographic location and why is it that there are ghettos? Why is it that all these parts of cities or small towns are sectioned off? Small towns is typically train tracks, but those things have been written into law. There's been redlining, right? And so ghettos didn't appear out of nowhere. They were intentionally created communities to keep people of color, and specific, I would argue, Black people, impoverished. So as we talk about these things, I think it's important to really know what it is that we're saying and what it is that we're talking about, because we can be well-intentioned and fired up and passionate. But if we don't have history and education behind that passion, thank you very much for your passion, but you're gonna gas out, you're gonna burn out, and I don't have time to pick your pieces up. It's not my job, right?
Yeah. So I think that history is so important, and I also think that there's a centering effect of talking about that history, which is that a lot of times when we talk about racism in a modern context, people want to talk about it as like a feeling or a thought that some people have, instead of talking about it as like a history or a system of exploitation. I love that Ta-Nehisi Coates uses the word plunder to talk about it, is that its ultimate aim and purpose was the generation of wealth for one group of people and the extraction of wealth from that other group of people.
Yeah.
And that, and so, when we talk about it and we recognize that racism isn't limited to an attitude that an individual or a group of individuals can have, but is actually the fact that we have segregated neighborhoods, and neighborhoods that are segregated not just by race but also therefore by class, and that that these things are generational. They feed on each other. That even though a present day experience of a person, maybe a present day white person isn't themselves feeling they're getting a lot of handouts from the government, but they're living on land that was homesteaded by white people, that in neighborhoods that were exclusive to white people. Here in Oregon, the entire state was a white utopia. You couldn't move here if you weren't a person of color. As late as like the early 2000s, there were still housing communities in Oregon where the rules on the book said that you couldn't move here move there if you were a person of color. That's all illegal now, of course, but it doesn't. But that's not ancient history. We're talking about 15 years ago.
Right. And I feel like not understanding that for me as a Black person is part of my utmost frustration, because those things matter. That matters where you can begin to possibly build wealth, where you're able to go to school. I think it's interesting if you take a look at just our Presbyterian pastors, how many are Black, and of those who are Black, how many, what's their salary? What churches are calling them? Do they feel comfortable in their congregations, right? The church, white supremacy, and Christianity have really gone hand in hand since modernity, right? And so to argue that the church has not been complicit in some way as an institution, I think is just a lie, The church has. And so I think our work is super important because it's undoing that distortion of the Bible that we've been hanging on to. Or justifying. And silence is a justifier as far as I'm concerned. Silence isn't neutral. So yeah.
And Annanda, while you're talking briefly on the church's complicity, there, Reverend Ross Reddick in the comments or in the feed, he asked if you have any thoughts or if you're familiar with the 1999 PCUSA document, Facing Racism, a Vision of the Beloved Community. It's one of those reports that our denomination loves to put out, and then often doesn't get read by most people. So are you familiar with it?
I'm familiar with it. To be honest with you, I haven't looked in depth at it. To your comment, when the denomination does put out some pretty rad stuff, but no, we rarely do look at it. And we're great with doing studies and works, but I think we're also horrible at implementing it, where we just get caught up in our committees and our groups. So for me, I'd rather, if the information's out there, I'd rather have folks who do the good work of putting it out there and the hard self work, but actually going out into community and making relationship with, not on behalf for. So to give you an example, can I just move on to kind of maybe give examples of what I've done in relationship to the Black Lives Matter movement? Would that be helpful?
That would be great. Yes, please.
Okay. So to give a brief example, what I've done here at First Pres Palo Alto is again, I think history and context is important for how you do Black Lives Matter in your particular congregation. So my congregation is a congregation where I really don't have to worry that much per se about being Black in a sense, right? I'm in Palo Alto, but the congregation itself is actually they're uber progressive. If anything, I have to push them back a little bit to make sure they got some good Bible and theological foundation before they're just ready to go in March. But adult studies work here. So historically speaking, if they do an adult study, they tend to get fired up, and then they like to be in relationship after, go out and do. So what I've done with with my adult study is slow them down a bit. Since they're doers, I transformed and said, well, how are we being? And so I made them through Advent, or I shouldn't say make, through Advent, for those who participated, and had about 50 participants, we did a journal, and every day in Advent, it takes 27 days to make a habit, so I wanted to make a habit of compassion, because the truth of the matter is you can't participate in Black Lives Matter if you are low on compassion. And so every day they journaled about compassion that they witnessed, compassion that they may have felt, or maybe the lack of compassion, and then we'd meet together in small groups, and I did journals because, you know, it's Advent, it's a busy time, it's a busy season, and folks tend to be beholden to be in the small group as opposed to the content. And so I wanted them to have their content, so no matter who showed up that week, they would still talk about it. So we focus on compassion in relation to the lectionary, and so we tie that in constantly with spirituality, because that's the well that has to flow, right? If your well is empty, if your well is dry, if you're not rooted in the Bible and theological teachings, you're gonna burn out pretty quick. And so I needed for them to do self-work first. And then when it came time for Epiphany, then we began to discuss, you know, in depth, white supremacy, Black Lives Matter. And to be honest with you, I even went into a little bit of Native history, because I think it's important that the two economic foundations of our country came off of settler colonialism and commercial and residential real estate, which happened to do with Native genocide, right? And then free market labor, which was Black bodies, and has also been a form of genocide since the beginning of the country, right? And so to get that understanding, that's where American wealth comes from, and how our wealthy church participates and has participated in that, was huge. And so now we're on the goal of, now that we've done this self-work and this awareness, how are we in better relationship with our neighbors here and now? And so for me, that isn't just going out and doing a workshop somewhere with them, right? Because I think we typically do that. Like, hey, your congregation get together, my congregation get together. I also want to feel good if we're doing this great thing, but it's also coming from a great place. I love to do this service project. I think that's good, but I think that's a Band-Aid. I think it's charity. It's not actually being a part of a movement for change. And so now we're doing letter writing to congregations. We're building relationships. And so I want to build relationship first. And I'm mindful that I'm an intern, so I'm only here for a year. So I don't want to do something that they can't take on themselves, but build relationships and then meet together, right? And see how we can co-work in our community, as opposed to, too often I see predominantly white churches do something great, but it's over and above. There's still white control. You know what I mean? Instead of working with Black communities, right? And so, like, I look at, you know, if we're to get together with the AME Zion Church, we're not meeting here at the Presbyterian Church. We're meeting at the AME Zion Church, right? And so things like that, I think, are super important, because I think there's a disconnect, even though something's well-intentioned. Like, even though your Presbyterian church might have better facilities than the Black church, you need to go to the Black church. You're scared to go to the hood? Nobody in the hood's gonna bother you. If anything, you might actually get a police escort, right? like these are things that just like blow my mind. Like, nobody in the hood in their right mind is gonna come at you, white person. They're not, because you're gonna end up on the news, because your life matters, right? Like, so, I mean,
wow.
It's one of these things that bothers me when I hear like this fear, and it's like, this fear for what? Like, yes, you have your wits about you like in any other place, but I have more reason to fear walking in the hood than you do, right? Like, come on. So I think those myth busters.
Yeah, that's fabulous. And I think that I keep hearing this as well from other organizers, other people working in the movement for Black Lives, about the importance, particularly for white people, of doing that self-work, with other white people, and not asking and expecting people of color to lead you through it or do it for you. So, I mean, thank you, Annanda, that you're doing this great work in the church. But I think we need more churches where this work is actually white people are doing it with and among white people for themselves, and not asking people of color to teach them how to do it. And an aspect of that work, you keep hitting on the fact that if you're not if you don't have enough compassion, if you haven't built up enough of this, you're going to burn out, and I don't have time to sustain you. An aspect of that, I think, for me is what people are calling white fragility, the sense that like white people, we get into these conversations and there's responses of fear and anxiety, or there's legitimate responses of pain coming from people of color, and white people don't know how to handle Black people's pain. So instead of just sort of sitting in it, or going and finding somewhere to handle it themselves, they then lash back out, or they get defensive, or there was a great article I read yesterday about in the Toronto scene of the movement for Black Lives. There was this white activist who wrote this big public letter, open letter, demanding the resignation of one of the major leaders of the movement because she said some things that offended him. And and the rest of the movement was like, dude, you can't do that.
That's not
you can't do that. It's not how this works, and it's not your place in any like realm to do that. So if you're working through some stuff because you have some of your own pain you need to deal with, that you need to not be putting that out there on other people. So
yes,
I think the word resilience is so important to resistance. The idea that you need to be able to handle some uncomfortable stuff. You need to be able to handle some guilt, some pain, some judgment, and you need to be able to come back and cope with it, and then come back and still be strong to be in support, to know where your lane is as an ally to support.
Yes, I agree with you 110%, Eric. I cannot stress that enough. I think that's huge. And to be honest with you, if you break down and cry, like, I can only help you so much. I really can only help you so much. And yeah, you got to deal with your stuff. And I do think those are conversations that white folks need to have amongst each other and to process. And there are spaces in the country, there are groups where you can do that. That is what it's about. Because your hurt, your pain is real. At the same time, you're not dying in the street. You're not 11 times more likely to get picked up by a cop. You don't have to be on level 10 all day, every day at your job, at your workplace. Like, there's just a whole life that you don't have to live, which I don't want you to feel guilty about that. But at the same time, like, just know your place, like, know your place. And then that probably came off harsh, but it's kind of true. I cannot help you with your tears, but you do need to work on them.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with the Church of All Nations in Minneapolis at all, but
I am familiar.
Pastor Jin there, he does a lot of work with white people on white supremacy, and he talks a lot about how how, as you said at the beginning, how white supremacy stole so much from white people. Obviously, it hurt people of color worse, but it hurt white people. He says it hurts people of color worse, but it hurt white people first, in the sense that, like, in order to be able to dehumanize other people, white people first had to be dehumanized themselves, to lose some sort of central element of themselves. So I think there is a sense in which, like, those tears are real, and I think for a lot of white people, it's the first time they're crying them. Like, it's centuries of suppression, it's centuries of not facing this, and it's the first time they're actually recognizing, holy crap, I am a part of a thing that is awful, and that is a heavy thing for some of us to deal with, and so that is not your work to handle that. But I do think that's real work. That's work that we've got to do, is to go, like, how have we lost, we've lost so much of our soul, we've lost so much of our humanity, how do we recover that? And I think crying, actually, that's part of how you recover it, is just grieving for that loss.
That makes sense. And for me as a Black person, right, I've had to tell my colleagues here, there's some things I just don't get. And for you to say that's maybe the first time, those white folks are feeling that and hearing that pain, for me, it's just like, oh, right? Like, I wouldn't think that's I think I talk about in the book how it's like breathing for me. Like where do you want to start? I'm talking about like something as commonplace as taking in air. And for me, I just had a learn light bulb moment. Like, oh, of course, of course, this would be the first time, right? So that helps me too with patience and also graciousness throughout it, right? Because it's something like I wouldn't think about. And I think too, another way we get caught up, and I would say is this sense of Black or people of color altruism, right? And so like in this work, this idea that every Black person's right, or every, you know, Black person or person of color has, you know, good intentions. Like, no, keep your wits about you. You're all still people. So I think any way that dehumanizes, whether it's like in a criminal way or some like angelic, you know, altruistic, just unrealistic way, is also not helpful, right? So my goal is not to say that, you know, every Black person's right, or, you know, that's not, I'm right all the time. No. But it is to say, like, just keep that in mind, because I see that those two things jockey, is this criminalization and this high altruism, in particular in progressive circles, the altruism. And it's harmful. And I think it's also harmful when Black folks and people of color play into the altruism too. I think that's very dangerous. Or like this idea of righteousness that progressive communities have, because, you know, we're not battling the same kind of fundamentalism as conservative communities, where it's something is very, for lack of a better term, black and white, and it's easily right and wrong. I think the more complex you delve into the issues, the more complex they become. And so I think in the progressive side, you know, I think we need to be mindful that there's a thing called progressive fundamentalism, and it can be harmful and painful, and it operates differently than conservative, right? But it's the idea where you feel like you have to be politically correct all the time, right? Or there's no room for error, but you have to go hard. You have to go to the extremes every single time, always constantly fighting. And I feel like that's not what this movement is about. It's not about burnout. It's not about eating your own, you know, when they don't get everything particularly correct. For me, because the reality is we're all going to struggle, right? The discomfort, part of the discomfort is just learning. And you're going to make mistakes. You learn more from your failures typically than you do from your successes. And so for me, I rather somebody make a mistake in good intention and correct themselves than be too afraid to name something, feel paralyzed. And I really have seen this a lot in progressive communities, and we gotta stop being hyper judgmental of each other.
Yeah, and that there's you know, there's, I think, to put it in theological anthropology terms, for me, there's two ways to dehumanize with someone. One is to, you know, to call them a monster and less than human, and to push them down. And the other is to elevate them to sainthood, and to say that they're, you know, somehow superior than human. And both successfully distance you from that person and successfully make that person sort of off into a reserved area where they no longer have direct impact on your life as a peer, but become something other than that. And so we have to resist that impulse, either to sort of sanctify people or to demonize them, but to put them in, you know, to see their humanity and to relate to them in a human way.
Right. And meeting them where they are. Yeah. Go ahead.
To move a little bit to something that is interesting to me, the movement for Black Lives is unique, or I don't say unique, but it's doing something new compared with previous civil rights movements in the way that it relates to queer sexuality, to gender constructions, to women. I'm interested to hear a little bit about these new intersections, and the way that the movement for Black Lives is framing itself as it's intersectionality.
Yes, it's huge. It's huge. So Black Lives Matter, the movement actually started from 3 Black women, one of whom identifies as queer, openly out. The other one is Nigerian American, and the third one's Mexican American, African American. And I think this is important to name, not simply because you have Black feminists doing this work, but we all have these intersections of identity. And I talk about this in the chapter. Every single last one of us has a multiplicity of identities. And I believe that those multiplicity of identities are gifts. And Black Lives Matter has harnessed this because they realize even being Black is super complex, right? And historically, if we look at civil rights movement, abolitionist movement, the attention has mostly been on straight Black males, right? And historically speaking, it's not that this is the first time LGBTQ folk have been involved in the movement. We look at Bayard Rustin, who was an amazing organizer, Quaker. MLK actually learned a lot from him, and then he got pushed out of the civil rights movement because he was considered to be scandalized because he was caught with other men, right? And so he organized the March on Washington. So, but most people don't even know that he exists. And so the intersectional movement is basing off that work done in the 60s and 70s. I would argue it really kind of comes more from the Black Panther movement, who that particular Black nationalist movement got together LGBTQ folk, it got together the Native movement, it got together the farm worker Chicano movement, and really had a giant conglomerate of all of these folks. It was intersectional. And so we're seeing that now again, but revamped 2.0. And so what I think is interesting is this movement is coming predominantly out of the West Coast, which normally doesn't get talked about for any issues in regards to race, with the exception of like the riots, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it also brings awareness and attention that this is a national issue. It's not just something that's secluded in the South or areas like New York or Chicago. It exists everywhere. And these intersections recognize, I think, three key things: human dignity, interconnectedness, and interdependence. Because I think when you isolate in other groups of people, it's this idea that you don't need them, that you are not connected to them, and that they don't deserve the same dignity, the same basic rights that you do, right? And so intersectionality forces you to realize the complexity. And I think in church language, it's seeing the complexity of God in whom you encounter, right? And so the intersectionality allows for this kingdom work, right? So there's some gifts, Eric, that you have that I don't. There are some sections, some groups, social settings that you can enter into that I can't, based off of your multiplicity of identities, right? And so how you go about doing the work of Black Lives Matter and how I go about doing the work of Black Lives Matter, some of our work will intersect as we're leaders in the church, right? But some of that stuff, you can reach folks that I can't, and vice versa, just for the nature of who you are, the history of where you've been. And so I think Black Lives Matter really harnesses this in a way that previous civil rights movements have not. Furthermore, if you notice, it doesn't have one particular leader, right? So before, we had MLK, we had Malcolm X, we had Huey, right? And notice I'm naming all men that most people know. Like, everybody just thinks Rosa sat on a bus because she was tired. It wasn't the case, and she was always packing a gun, by the way. Like, most people don't, like, most people don't know. And so I think this different model of not just having a lone wolf, but having chapters. So you could actually go to blacklivesmatter.com, because yes, there's a website, and try to plug into your local chapter and activities. So this is more like cell groups, right? That pop up throughout the country that are able to meet the particular needs of the geographic location that they're in. And so I think this actually works hand in hand with the church, because churches are designed to meet the particular spiritual needs of their community that they geographically inhabit, right? And so if anything, I feel like the organization of Black Lives Matter is ingenious, because it's not, you can't just squash one group. That's what happened in the civil rights movement, right? Everybody wound up shot or in jail really quickly, actually, like within a very short time period. And so this way it becomes harder to pin down a particular leader to grab a group of people, and it forces folks to become leaders within their own communities in ways in which they might not have previously. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that not just structurally that makes the movement more complex and more interesting and more difficult to combat, to defeat, but I also think ideologically it makes the movement more resilient, because one of the things about the sort of white-black construction of race is that the very purpose of that simplicity is to like sort of hide the complexity of our identities.
Yeah.
You know, all of the anti-miscegenation laws are about trying to basically make it so that there can be no middle ground, that there is only, you know, if you have one drop of black blood, then you're black. And if you have, you know, to be white, you have to be 100% pure, or however that's defined in the various different periods. We don't want to admit things like the fact that Italians and Irish and Polish people weren't white at one point in time.
Yes.
You know, that whiteness itself is mutable and you know, and a construct. So if we start to admit the complexity of our identities, the very basis of white supremacy starts to fall apart, because we have to admit that actually it's just way more complicated than that. There really isn't such a simple thing as, you know, as white in a singular pure kind of sense.
Yes, and it forces you to claim yourself, the part of yourself that's been denied and the part of the self that you deny. It forces you to claim it, which I think is huge, and it works. You know, like I've seen folks in my congregation say, oh, you know, I go back to my grandmother's time in Lithuania in trenches, or, you know, my Irish great-grandfather. Like, it works because you're realizing, like, no, you're part. And yes, the Irish were enslaved at one point. Like, chattel slavery is actually based off of, to a certain extent, how the Irish were enslaved, and they just took it and ramped it up, right? And so, so like, yes, it's a reclaiming of your humanity, in spite of. And that resilience. And
I think one aspect that's been unfortunate about the way that white supremacy has worked on people of color in this country is that in order to achieve some level of acceptability and respectability, you know, Black people had to be Christianized, they had to be Europeanized, and they had to, as part of that, therefore, sort of adopt some of the patriarchal systems of white European culture, which has meant that, unfortunately, the Black church at times has also repeated those patterns in ways that are unhealthy. So when we start to talk about, you know, genderqueer identities and things like that, that's also breaking down that historical sort of adoption of things that have been harmful as well.
Yes. And, you know, for me as a Black queer woman, Black Lives Matter is one of those things, just like, finally, I can bring all of myself to my own Black liberation, right? Like, I don't have to parcel myself out because I'm a woman. I have to parcel myself out and be quiet about me being queer, but I can bring all of myself. And isn't that what liberation is about? The ability to bring all of your multiplicity of identities and be freed from it. Because, you know, the truth is, right, like, my freedom is inextricably tied to your freedom, which I think is a beautiful way of saying love your neighbor as you love yourself, right? Like, and you can't have one without the other. You truly can't. So yeah, it was beautifully put, Eric. Beautifully put.
Well, and what's been so encouraging to me in the past 5 years is to watch different movements recognize that in each other and say, we have to be there and support each other. In other words, I was at Standing Rock last November, and there was a huge Black Lives Matter presence there. There was a huge Palestinian liberation movement presence there. There's been connections between Ferguson and Palestine. There's been connections between, you know, there's this awareness that that has become really concrete of just what you're saying, that my liberation is bound up in your liberation, and that making it physically present and concrete to me is, I don't have words for it that aren't theological. It's just beautiful. It's a movement of the spirit. I see a new thing happening, which is the most hopeful thing I see in society around us right now.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like oppression, systemic oppression isn't unique in how it operates. I think what makes it unique is in who it targets, right? And so like when you realize you just plug and chug the multiplicity of people groups, the operation is somewhat the same, right? But coming together and your strength in numbers, right? Always, always, always. And you can see, I think, for me, on a powerful moment was on Twitter during Ferguson, Palestine, you know, telling folks in Ferguson how to deal with tear gas, right?
Yeah.
Think locally, act globally. That was a great example of how social media just across the world, they're like, hey, I'm oppressed here, you're oppressed here. Let me show you how I deal with this. And vice versa is huge. It's massive. And I think the idea too of when you have different people groups, particular folks of color coming together, does not mean white folks, you're not welcome, right? It doesn't mean like, oh, white folks can't join this too. To me, it means if you join, like just come correct, come knowing you're gonna be uncomfortable, but know that you're welcome. Because the truth is, in order for white supremacy to be dismantled, we need white allies who want to dismantle white supremacy. That's just the truth of the matter. So for me, it's not a matter of not being welcome, but just be very intentional. Because I can't take my Black away, I can't take my queer away. I could try to hide the queerness, but
But that has a cost too, right? Like in doing that, you lose a part of yourself. You participate in your own dehumanization and suffer in that. So it's even identities which are maybe less visible than skin color based racism. If we don't live into those identities in authentic and honest ways, we pay a price for that. We pay a terrible price for that.
Yeah. I mean, that's what leads to most, when LGBTQ folks kill themselves, right? Like that's what that price is. The price is your life. Yeah, are there any, I guess we have a few minutes. Should we take questions, specific questions?
Yeah, I was looking through the feed to see if anyone had put in any questions here. There's lots of thanks, amen. I appreciate that. Regina Heater saying she really appreciates you're talking about the grounding need for self-work and building relationships together to do co-work in there. I wonder if you might be interested in just talking a little bit about sort of like, not directly related to the church, but big picture right now with our nation. We just obviously are all kind of reeling from this election and this, and I wonder if you have any thoughts about the ways you see white supremacy playing out in that, and what that says to you about the urgency of this work now. I mean,
yeah. Oh, many a thought. So first off, I think clearly the Trump administration played off of classic white fear in order to garner support. And if you notice that white fear always goes down to attacks of being able to provide for yourself and your family, safety, those are typically the two things, economics and safety, and use those fears and placated certain people groups, right? Attributed immigration, criminalization, so law and order. Whenever I hear that, all I see is more jail cells, right? And so for me, it was very clear that even though Trump did not win the popular vote, even though the Electoral College got him in, everything that he ran on was placating off of classic kind of white supremacist fear. So for me, that's already alarming because now it's actually in the White House. And now Steve Bannon, who's alt-right, which is a nice way to say white supremacist with a tie, or, is now his advisor. And so I think this work now is incredibly timely because we've seen now the Muslim ban go into effect. Now we've had the ICE raids. If anything, it's not that I don't take Donald Trump at his words, that I do. Right? And so for me, I'm now waiting with Jeff Sessions being, passed through what that means for our criminal justice system, what that means for dignity, frankly, what that means for democracy. And so our work now is really important and really crucial. It was before, but I think it's heightened now. I would argue act as if, you know, we're in a state of emergency, because as far as I'm concerned, I don't want to wait till something gets worse. It's already bad enough as it is. So I think the work.
Yeah, it really hit me that, you know, Jeff Sessions was too racist. To be a judge in the 80s, but he's, you know, just racist enough to be our attorney general now.
And do you know how racist you have to be for like other, like, do you know how racist you have to be for other white people, in particular, like federal judges in a court system that is already like streamlined, you know, racism in such a massive way? I mean, it's a production, really. Do you know how racist you have to be for them to say that you're too racist? Like, you're so racist that in general, white people are uncomfortable with how racist you are. Like, that's how racist Jeff Sessions has to be for not to, like, and so it's mind-blowing to me. It's mind-blowing in one way, but it's also like, as Apple, you know, as American as American pie or apple pie, right? And another. And so I see this constant flux of two Americas that are constantly being fought for. And so I think now is the time really to get your boots on, get your waders, because now is the time. I don't think we should wait. When I hear wait to see what happens, we've seen enough of what happens, and it's all going through super fast, right? And so I think with the lack of facts, the lack of truth telling, I think now's the time when you have groups of people, Muslims, Black folk, immigrants, saying our communities are having problems. Now isn't the time to decipher for yourself if they are or not being attacked, being targeted. Now's the time to say, how can I help? Like, I recognize it, I identify it. How can I help in a way that doesn't fan the flames? And I think in particular with us as Christians, given our Christian privilege, and a lot of this coming from the administration is also an idea of being a good Christian, which is a continuation of white supremacy in the church, right? I think progressive Christians really have a huge voice to turn the narrative around, because most of the Christianity that's seen and portrayed in media is not coming from a progressive place, right? And so I think if anything, if you need something to kind of boost yourself up, I think take pride in knowing that you are a Christian who does not believe in these, you know, racist white supremacist values, but you have to show how Christianity participates in it in a different way, how Christianity dismantles it. I think one of the most radical things, in particular for people of color, to be is if you're a person of color, particularly Black or Native or actually Latino, right? And you're Christian, I think that's huge. I think it's a super subversive way, like despite Christianity having like dehumanized you historically, that you've still come through and can still see God like through all the BS that's been put on you. I think that's massive. And so I think, and it speaks volumes to your resilience. And I think one of the ways that white folk can show their own resilience is to really take a theological grapple of how to dismantle white supremacy and say, no, this isn't the teachings of Christ. No, my job is not dependent on the neck of somebody else, right? You take in the stranger. So I think that's huge. And again, I'm a more general person. I see the woods, not necessarily the tree. But you have to think about how that context works for your context. Like, I'm in Palo Alto, so Silicon Valley looks a lot different than the south side of Chicago or the North Atlanta suburbs that I came from, right? So how does that operate in your particular community in ways that speaks to the culture and context of your folk? Because you can't just plug and chug it in that sense, right?
Yeah, so I mean, I think there are a lot of people probably in the Presbyterian Church, a lot of people in other mainline congregations looking at predominantly white settings, majority white settings, where they're looking for ways to plug in. And I think that what you've just said about, just get your boots on, get out there. The movement is happening where you're at. find and connect with people in your area who are engaged in this. And when you do, come correct. Recognize your place as as a person who benefits from white privilege, as a person who has received the largesse of white supremacy. How are you going to be in position and support that? So here in Portland, for example, I know when I show up to a rally or I show up to a meeting, my role largely is not to speak or to try and insert my voice into the conversation, but to be visible in support for what's going on from the outside. And I've been asked repeatedly, so for example, when we march, that I march to the outside because the police are less likely to engage in violent confrontation with me than they are with people of color who are present marching. So, learning some of those things about like, what is my job here when I'm here? And that's what it is. And so learning how to do those things. And we actually do have a couple people putting in some questions I want to throw out there for you real quick.
Yeah.
Leslie Martinborough is asking, is there any work that you know of being done to bring predominantly Black churches' needs into the conversation in the broader church? And she later on says, needs might be the wrong word. It's how to bring them into the spiritual aspect of resistance and changing the larger church.
That's a great question. I do not know. That's not to say that it hasn't been done. I've been hyper concentrated locally here, given the recent administration and everything going on. But to my knowledge, no, there's not a broader movement, to my knowledge. And my knowledge is limited at the moment because I'm hyper focused with what's going on right here.
And then another question here, and I think this one's really good since I know a number of the people who are following these seminars are pastors. Since white supremacy is so much a part of our political system, how explicitly political would you think you would ask churches to be in dismantling it?
That's a great question. I would say some churches are more explicitly political than others. I know you have a 501c3 to think about, to risk, depending on how political you want to be. And so for me, it boils down to your integrity. Do you feel like you are sacrificing the integrity of the gospel if you are silent, or do you feel like you're upholding it? So for here, when we're a sanctuary church, we just become a peace church, which means if anybody's conscientious objector, they can come to our congregation. How we talk about politics in the pulpit is different on any given Sunday. But so I say mind your integrity, because I think once you feel like you are speaking or being silenced in a way that is silencing the integrity of that which you feel called to do as a pastor, then I feel like that's a flag. But there are creative ways to do it. So to be explicitly political doesn't necessarily mean that you have to preach a political sermon every Sunday in the pulpit, but you can be explicit about your small groups and how those small groups navigate communities, or the actions that they do. So I say creativity is huge in that department. But prayers of the people, like you can get pretty down and dirty at the prayers of the people, in my experience, or rituals around the political harms that have been done. So I know, like last weekend, we wrote Valentine's letters to our Muslim neighbors in the community. And then, yesterday I dropped them off to the different mosques. For some folks, that might be too much. For other folks, that's too little, right? And so the integrity.
Yeah, and I feel, as someone who preaches in 2 congregations every week, I feel pretty, and I always have felt pretty at liberty to preach what many would regard as a political message, just leaning on my best understanding of Jesus and reading the gospel. I mean, I feel like you preach pretty solidly from the gospel every week, and you don't shy away from its meaning and its message. And I think it'll be hard not to end up being pretty political to a certain degree.
Right, and Christ was killed by the state, right? Like Christ was executed by the Roman state. So it's inherently political, right?
So Annanda, this has been amazing, and I'm so grateful to you for spending some time with us this morning to go through some of this and break some of this down for us. I'm just grateful to you, and I wonder if there's anything you want to conclude with, any messages of encouragement or challenge that you want to offer to people who are watching this, hoping for some tools.
So encouragement, I say, stay encouraged. Some days are harder than others, for sure. But always have hope. Hope is what gets you through. And so I feel like if you feel like you're losing some hope, I think it's a great time to tap out and recoup. And in terms of challenge, I challenge you to be uncomfortable. I challenge you to be uncomfortable, to learn something new. And I challenge you to, this is going to sound paradoxical, but be at peace in your discomfort. And that's something that for white folks, that's going to look different than what it's going to look like for folks of color. But I challenge that to all, because it's in the discomfort that we grow and that we become more aware, and make it less about our anxieties and more about our humanity and dignity and the dignity of others. Because at the end of the day, this is what we're talking about. We're talking about basic human dignity and compassion. That's what it boils down to.
Amen. Yeah, and I think that one thing that I have tried to take on board for myself is the recognition that, in a certain sense, I'm not going to see the promised land on this. I'm always going to be uncomfortable. We've had centuries of white supremacy. I'm not going to see the day where we arrive at a place where that has been fully dismantled or successfully, reconfigured in our society. So learning to be at peace in my being uncomfortable is a necessary survival skill, because I'm going to need it for the long haul. So this has been our resistance seminar today, talking about dismantling white supremacy. We're going to continue these every week, Wednesday at noon Eastern time. We're talking about chapters from Rick Ufford Chase's book, Faithful Resistance, with each of the contributors. Next week, we're actually going to talk about creation care and the environment. We're going to talk about fossil fuel companies and what's going on in our culture right now with Abby Mohopt, who is just a badass. She's awesome. So I'm excited to have her here. Annanda, thank you so much for talking with me today. This has been fabulous.
Thanks so much.